Greetings, friends. It's Michael Parker, and welcome back to another episode. August 4th of this year will be the 61st anniversary of the death of film star Marilyn Monroe. The son of one of her famous paramours just happens to be running for president, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Monroe's death and the death of John F. Kennedy were both subjects of interest to journalist Dorothy Kilgallen. Dorothy was essentially the Barbara Walters of her day. Like Monroe, Kilgallen's death would be ruled an overdose. Today's guest, Mark Shaw, questions the deaths of both Monroe and Kilgallen in his recent book, Collateral Damage, The Mysterious Deaths of Marilyn Monroe, JFK, and Dorothy Kilgallen, and the ties that bind them to Robert F. Kennedy and the JFK assassination. Mark also points out the similarities between Marilyn Monroe and grunge superstar Kurt Cobain in the days leading up to their deaths. We begin our conversation with Mark asking me what I think happened to Kurt Cobain.
Well, what I saw was that you had, at one point co-owned a punk rock club in Fort Worth. But what was interesting to me was that you had hosted some of the upcoming bands, and one of them was Nirvana.
Yes.
And I get so many people who get in touch with me because of my experience and all of that with being an investigative reporter and all of that, who tell me, Mark, you've got to investigate the death of Kurt Cobain.
Yes.
And thus far, I haven't done so. I have been mentoring a woman up in Washington State who has done extensive research on this now. And I didn't know whether you followed Nirvana's career and ever had any thoughts about Cobain, but I'd like to ask you what your thoughts are. Obviously, the official conclusion, and I have trouble with these conclusions especially, and we'll talk about the autopsies in each of the three subjects you mentioned, because that's the easiest way to cover up a murder, is that you produce a faulty autopsy. But what's your thought about Cobain? Do you think the suicide verdict is authentic?
I'll be honest, I do not know. And it's funny because the night that Nirvana played my club, I wasn't there that night because my brother and I owned it. I was working a full-time job. I was in two different bands at that time. And honestly, we kind of made fun of Nirvana at that point because they sounded like a lot of bands that we were already playing with, because our little crew that we ran with in Texas was pretty cutting edge. So, the kids that came to our club wanted us to book Nirvana, so we booked Nirvana. Now, that being said, I love Nirvana now. I kind of came around after the fact, but I will say this: Kurt, I think, was a very sensitive person, and I think it's possible that he could have killed himself. But I also think it's possible that somebody could have killed him. I've watched the documentaries, and I cannot tell you that I know for sure one way or the other. And I have I have met Courtney Love. And she was one of the first kind of minor celebrities I met when I moved to Hollywood. And she wasn't famous yet at that point. And she's a whole lot of crazy. Let me just say that. So I'm not saying that she was involved in it, but I do not have a firm opinion either way. I believe both of them are possible. I also understand that Cobain had serious abdominal issues. They never said it was Crohn's disease, but he was kind of famous for having these abdominal issues, which he claimed heroin helped with. So he's a super sensitive person who I don't think enjoyed being a rock star. He's got abdominal issues. He's married to a crazy woman, and he's doing heroin. So he's not in the bet, and I'm a fan. So I say that with love and respect. But I don't know if he was killed, although I could certainly see it.
Well, if you don't mind, I haven't done this before, but I can give you some comparisons between Cobain's death and Marilyn Monroe's.
Please.
And a lot of this has to do with my real disagreement, and I'm always looking for cover-ups, and I'm looking for government corruption and all of that when I'm working on my books. So you can see there's some similarities between Cobain and Marilyn. One of them is exactly what you just said. You said that there were all these media reports. He's got this abdominal thing. He's doing heroin. He's this. He's that. Well, I can tell you that this woman up in Washington State who's really looking into this, and she's found a former policeman who's working with her too. She sent me about a page and a half of all of the positive things that were going on in Cobain's life before he died. He was upbeat. He was feeling like he was going to be creative again. He was writing songs. He was doing all this and all of that. So,
Mark, I want to just stop you for a second. I just want to stop you for a second. He was the biggest rock star in the world at that point. And I was working in music retail, and I was a buyer for a major music chain. And I also, I was in bands. I was making records too. He was the biggest rock star in the world at that moment. He may have been an accidental rock star at that time, that he maybe didn't like all the publicity and public acclaim and all of that. And yes, he was married to a very unstable woman. There's no question about that. But my point is that the mainstream media at that time, it was all about everything bad in his life. Yeah. And this has happened now with Marilyn Monroe, not only back in 1962. August 4th will be 60 years since she died. Mm-hmm. And, when I started looking into this, I did my research here, I'll admit it. I did my research here with these three subjects, a little ass backwards. I first landed on the, to give you a little background, I first landed on the JFK assassination because I actually practice law. You're in L.A., I'm up near San Francisco, and I actually practiced law for a while with Melvin Belli, the famous court lawyer, and who became the lawyer for Jack Ruby in the 1980s. And so I first looked at the JFK assassination. Long story short, his representation of Ruby made no sense whatsoever. He wasn't a criminal defense lawyer. He never let Ruby testify. He made him look crazy. I mean, always wondered about that. And then that led me to showing that Belli was really affectionate with the mafia. He loved the mafia. Mm-hmm. The mafia loved him at that time. His main client was Mickey Cohen, who's the famous gangster down from where you're living now. Yes. And so I looked into that. Then I decided, hey, if there's something wrong here, I'm going back to the '60 election. So I was able to show, and obviously it's well known that Joe Kennedy knew they were going to lose the '60 election to Richard Nixon, and so they rounded up some of their mafia buddies, Giancana and Carlos Marcello and others, and they were able to use Mayor Daley in Chicago, get some votes there, and then do the same thing in West Virginia, and they ended up winning the election. And so I was able to do that in a book called The Poison Patriarch about Joe Kennedy. And, immediately when they won the election, they had promised the mafia they'd leave them alone, but Joe double-crossed them by appointing Bobby Kennedy Attorney General, and he immediately went after those mobsters. Yeah. So I looked into that, and that led me to conclude that, hey, we need to look more at why Bobby Kennedy wasn't killed instead of why JFK was, and that's a different point of view in doing that, and then I landed on this woman that you mentioned and a lot of your listeners may not have heard of. That's Dorothy Kilgallen. And Dorothy Kilgallen was a very well-respected, Pulitzer Prize-nominated journalist in New York City. She worked for the New York Journal-American at the time, had a column syndicated to 200 newspapers. She had a radio program listened to by 1 million people a day, and many of your listeners may remember that she was the star performer on a quiz show called What's My Line? It was on CBS every Sunday night. They guessed people's unusual occupations. 10 million people watched that show. Mm-hmm. So I landed on Dorothy, and what I found out was that she and JFK were friends, and she ended up going to the Jack Ruby trial, and out of 400 reporters, she was the only one who interviewed Jack Ruby. And whatever he told her then there, she went ahead and she looked into the motive for killing JFK, which landed on this Carlos Marcello, the mafioso in New Orleans. Yeah. And she was about to go ahead and expose all that and J. Edgar Hoover's cover-up and everything in a book that she was writing for Random House when she was found dead in her townhouse. And we can go into the details of that, a staged death scene and everything. So I was done. That was enough for me to write. But I then was asked by readers around the world, what about Marilyn Monroe? Is there any connection between the deaths of Marilyn Monroe, JFK, and Dorothy Kilgallen? And the first thing that I noticed, it's amazing that I hadn't before, Marilyn died in 1962, JFK in 63, and Dorothy in 65, 40 months apart. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered, because the official verdict, as you remember, was what they called probable suicide.
that she had killed herself. Those were the headlines, the mainstream media. You know, she was on the downside of her career. She was a drug addict. She was this. It was that. All of this was in the media. In fact, I want to talk about a little bit the Netflix documentary that was in April. Anthony Summers, who is as distorted a history author as ever lived, and how they build up. They called her in that documentary a whore and a terrible person, and she was, you know, all these different things. And so what they did in 1962, the mainstream media painted her as being suicidal. But then I found a Dorothy Kilgallen story about her. And Michael, it talked about Marilyn's on the upswing. She's going to Hollywood parties. She's got a new love interest that's more famous than her second husband, Joe DiMaggio, the Major League Baseball legend for the Yankees. She's got movie offers. She's this, she's that, and all of that. And she just bought a house. She always wanted to own a house. She just got a dog that she loved. She was going to remarry DiMaggio. But see, the mainstream media just left that out. And so what happened is when Marilyn died then, they just never investigated, just like they did in Dorothy Kilgallen's death and also with the JFK assassination. And so each one of these individuals was denied justice. But it's really fascinating and disturbing at the same time how somehow or another each of these people died. And here was the main problem. I really encourage people, ask questions.
Yes.
Back in '62, nobody asked questions about why Marilyn Monroe would have committed suicide. In '63, nobody asked the right questions who really had the motive to have killed JFK, and certainly it was not Oswald alone. In my new book, Fighting for Justice in the Fall, I've gotten inside the Warren Commission and found all the government corruption in there, and that'll be in the new book. And then with Dorothy, they just came to her home where there was a staged death scene. She had on her eyelashes, her hairpiece, and her makeup in a bedroom she never slept in, and they found an empty Seconal bottle, and the ME just said, well, it's another celebrity who overdosed, when that wasn't even possible, and I've proven in my books, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and this new one, Fighting for Justice, she was murdered. There were 3 barbiturates in her system, not 1, and I've been able to put motive together with that. So whatever it is, I don't care. A small matter in the neighborhood or with COVID or with these kinds of terrible, tragic deaths, we need to ask questions, and not enough people ask those questions, and that has to change.
Mark, and not to derail us, but I just want to throw this into the mix. I'm with you, and it's like whenever these famous people die in suicides or whatever, and we started talking about Kurt Cobain. Well, let's talk about Jimi Hendrix. Let's talk about Jim Morrison. A lot of these people that died mysteriously. Well, first of all, Jimi Hendrix's manager, Mike Jeffries, was CIA, and he was a horrible guy, and he would later die in an airplane crash. But a lot of these people that posed questions, not even questions, I guess threats to the just status quo, could be perceived as a national threat. Now, did someone kill all of these people? I don't know, but I certainly don't doubt that it's possible, and especially in the case of Marilyn Monroe, because I wrote down a whole list of questions about you, and I was listening to some of your interviews earlier, and the pillow talk that she and the 2 brothers shared were certainly enough to get her killed, I would think.
Well, yes, and I know when you do your investigations and you are trying, from what I've understood and what I've done with my research, you're a man of the truth, and so you want to find the truth.
Yes.
So what do? Well, you start your investigation, and I would assume that the same thing happens to you that happens to me. You don't know where you're going with the investigation, and then all of a sudden, and I will say that Dorothy Kilgallen has kind of been my guiding light with regard to all of this. She wrote all these Oswald alone theories don't make sense. She had all these columns that infuriated J. Edgar Hoover at the time JFK died. But when I was trying to connect the 3 of these, and maybe you heard this in the other interviews, I came across a CIA document, and I'm not a complete believer in it, in those kinds of documents, but I've been able to circle around and confirm a lot of things. And what you're alluding to is on the 3rd of August, 1962, there was a CIA document that I found at the National Archives, a very reputable place to find, your sources and everything, and that's one day before Marilyn died. And what was fascinating to me, and people can read it and make up their own mind. It's in Collateral Damage. It's going to be in Fighting for Justice coming out in November. It was just gold, because what it did is it talked about, in the first paragraph, wiretaps of Dorothy Kilgallen talking to a man named Howard Rothberg, who was a friend of hers, and they were talking about JFK, and they were talking about Robert Kennedy, and they were talking about Marilyn. And so I found that. And then, more to the point of what you mentioned, were the wiretaps of Marilyn Monroe and Robert Kennedy's conversations. Now, what I did when I was dealing with where to go with my journey here to find out what happened to Marilyn, if you'll remember, I said that in Dorothy's column, Marilyn is on the upswing. I failed to say she has a love affair she's into a love affair that's more alluring than Joe DiMaggio. Well,
I caught
many people know, and your listeners will too, that what they were talking about at that time could have really been Marilyn and JFK. Because they had had a love affair after she sang Happy Birthday to him at Madison Square Garden. I think it was his 45th birthday. And, they were seen together, and there's all of that. And so they had that brief love affair. But Joe Kennedy put a stop to that because he was going to JFK was going to run for election, and he didn't want that splattered all over the newspapers. So who's the next biggest name? And that's when I turned to Robert Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And what I found was, in this particular document, and it was the one that just, jumped out at me, because the first page of that was talking about this love affair that Robert Kennedy had with Marilyn Monroe. And it read, Robert Kennedy was deeply involved emotionally with Marilyn Monroe and repeatedly promised to divorce his wife, Marilyn. And then it goes on to talk about how involved in her life he was, to the point of trying to negotiate some deals for her with 20th Century Fox. And so, that really led me to believe that there was a close relationship between them. RFK later completely denied all that, but we'll get into exactly where he was on the day that Marilyn died.
Dorothy Kilgallen essentially could be thought of as the Barbara Walters of her day, and I think that she and Marilyn Monroe were somewhat tight.
Yeah, they were friends. I had learned before that Marilyn and Dorothy knew each other. Marilyn had gone to parties at Dorothy's home, during the years before, leading up to when Marilyn died, and all of that. And so, that connection was really important to me, and also, in social circles in New York City, they spent time together. Dorothy a couple times made fun of how Marilyn dressed, and in her column, and Marilyn had told some people that this Kilgallen woman, she doesn't like me. She says bad things about me and things like that. But that was teasing between the two. Mm-hmm. But yes, they were definitely connected, and so Dorothy really took an interest in what happened to Marilyn. And I won't go into the long column that she wrote at one point, but she said the real truth about what happened to Marilyn has not been told. And so she didn't believe either. In fact, she told one of her housekeepers, it's the Kennedys. Well, why would it be the Kennedys? Because in this document, this CIA document, the second paragraph, it says that basically what they found was that there were these calls between Marilyn and RFK, and it was a torrid love affair in the summer of 1962. He was there trying to get a book of his called The Enemy Within about the Mafia published, and was all around there. And then I've been able to show that he visited her in her new home a couple of times and all that. Well, then RFK said that he was in New York, he was in San Francisco on the day she died, and we'll get into how I completely destroyed that alibi. But in this document, they have the talk about. Probably you don't know either that the three of them shared a very strong interest in UFOs. Now, I knew that was Dorothy one of the things I wanted to ask you about, but continue on. Yeah, because I found out that Dorothy had gone to London to a UFO convention and written about it in the LA Times. Marilyn was fascinated because JFK was fascinated and told her he was fascinated, and he was about to then go visit, what is it, Base 54 or whatever they called it, in New Mexico and all of that. And yeah, and that would have been embarrassing for him if this had gotten out. But the number 2, 3, and 4 points in the CIA document, I'll just read them, and then you can make up your mind as to why what was going to happen would have put Marilyn in peril. Subject repeatedly called the Attorney General and complained about the way she was being ignored by the President and his brother. Subject, and this is Marilyn, threatened to hold a press conference and would tell all. And number 4, then this is the one that would have, you can imagine if she'd have gone to the press with this. Subject made references, this is Marilyn, made references to bases in Cuba and of the president's plan to kill Fidel Castro. Also said she had some secret diaries and everything. Well, you can imagine that if Marilyn Monroe had gone to the public about the love affairs, it would have been very strong and would have caused them, obviously, a great deal of trouble. But if she goes to the media with these two Kennedys passing on to her matters of national security, which in some ways would amount to treason, both of those Kennedys would have been removed from office and probably indicted. So when you look at motive, and we'll get into the motive for killing Dorothy Kilgallen and the motives for killing JFK, but the motive just stuck out at me. I remember just, jumping up and down. My wife thought I had had a heart attack or something, because when I saw this, I knew that there was a motive had to be there, that the Kennedys could not let Marilyn Monroe go to the public. Go to the press. Go to the press.
I want to throw just a couple of points in on this. One, sure. On the pillow talk, it's like clearly they were doing that. And what you have to extrapolate beyond that, it's like, and I'm not a Kennedy hater or even really a Kennedy fan. They're historical figures to me. But this must happen a lot where these high leaders are sharing these types of national secrets with their mistresses. And the second thing is in regards to the UFO thing. I do know a lot about the UFO subject, and it was a huge popular subject in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s, to the point that I understand their interest in it. But what is more intriguing to me, and I will throw this in there too, the conspiracy theorists always said, they killed Marilyn Monroe because she had talked with JFK about the UFOs. I don't know that that's true, but the fact that you mentioned that they were all interested is significant. And what I would say is, like, you would think that people in these circles, if there was information that you could have access to, they would know about it. So the fact that they were obsessed with it tells me there's a story there. So just throwing that in as an aside.
Yeah. It's interesting because I noted that when you were talking about the human aspect of people.
Yes.
Well, we know this about a human being. When they know something that nobody else knows or that they think is vastly important and they're told to keep it secret, it is the damnedest thing to do so. We are all vulnerable to that. But these people who are in high office, and I don't care if they're on the left or the right or it's the Kennedys or whatever it is, you know, that ego, we want people to know, gosh, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but... So I have no doubt that it could have been pillow talk, but I also think it was just maybe in conversation. Here's the most famous actress in the world, the most beautiful woman in the world. I mean, anytime if you go watch, and I would suggest you do, and kind of your listeners do, in kind of a tribute to Marilyn on August 4th, go watch some of the films of hers on YouTube. When she's on the screen, there's nobody else there. I mean, she just lights it up. People look at her as a sex symbol. She was not a dumb blonde, and I can give you some instances of that. Hell, she read Ulysses. And I tried to read Ulysses and got about 6 pages. But if you go look at those movies, what I love more about her is that smile. Mm-hmm. That smile just lights up the world. And, she did not deserve to die here, but you can just imagine JFK for sure. He's president, and he may have said things to her. But Bobby Kennedy... He had never stepped foot in a courtroom and became the Attorney General of the United States of America. He was always the runt of the litter. I have more on the neurosis that affected the Kennedy men in fighting for justice. If no other reason, people take a look at that book, you will see a psychologist's examination that I found way back in the early 60s of the Kennedys and how they became sexual predators based on their father's conduct and everything. But you can just imagine.
Mark, I took note of that, and it was actually in my list of things to discuss with you, and I'm glad you brought it up, but we'll continue on.
Well, what I was going to say was that, you can just imagine, Bobby Kennedy is the runt of the litter. Nobody respects him as Attorney General. He's double-crossed the mafia. He's put JFK in peril and all of that. And so, he wants to prove himself. Well, Joe Kennedy had mistresses. Gloria Swanson, the famous film star, was his trophy. JFK had about 1,000 of them that he went out with. All the actresses, everybody else, and stuff like that. Well, here's Bobby with like 15 kids or whatever it was, and he's Attorney General, and there's not much respect paid to him. And so now, hey, here's Marilyn Monroe, and Marilyn Monroe likes me, and Marilyn Monroe will share herself with me, body and soul, and all of that. And you can just imagine him trying to impress her and talk to her about these kinds of things. And on the very weekend before Marilyn died, she and Bobby and some other people were up at a hotel, a casino up on the California-Nevada border, and finally she just had it with him. She just was tired. She said, "I feel like I've been used as a piece of meat." And that's when she came back down to L.A. and they had these conversations that threatened the Kennedys by going to the media.
The thing about the Kennedys, and the more I learn about the Kennedys, especially Daddy Joe, just a terrible guy, but the arrogance of these people. Who thinks that they can double-cross the mafia? I mean, of the worst ideas that you could have, that should be pretty close to the top, right?
Well, it is. Maybe you heard this in the interviews I did earlier in the week, but I have a story there because when I was a criminal defense lawyer, and then murder cases and everything, and then I decided not to do that anymore. I started analyzing famous trials. It started with Mike Tyson and others, and then I became a correspondent for Good Morning America. So at one point they said, "Well, you got this legal background. We actually have a lawyer for Angelo Bruno. He is the mafia boss of Philadelphia who will talk to us, this attorney." So they sent me over to Philadelphia, and I went to this guy's office, and I interviewed him. I can't remember his name, but I interviewed him. And he gave me some information about those people were not supposed to talk about these things, but he gave us information we couldn't believe. It was on the air the next morning. And it just to a huge applause of everybody in the country. They couldn't believe this guy was giving us secrets and all that. So producer said, "Well, Mark, why don't you go back and see if he'll talk to us again?" So I got on the phone, I called his office, and this woman answered. I said, "It's Mark Shaw with GMA, and I'd like to talk to Mr. So-and-so again." And there was complete silence. And time went by, and I said, "Hey, wait a minute, did you hear me?" And I could then tell she was crying. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Well, I guess you don't know. My boss started his car this morning, and it blew up." You can't mess around with those guys. They have their own rules, and that's exactly what Bobby Kennedy did. He deported Carlos Marcello to the no man's land in Guatemala, and when he got back in, he said to himself, "I am not going to put up with Bobby Kennedy anymore," and that was his motive for going after JFK, so Bobby would be powerless. And that's exactly what happened. The mafia never went after those. The Justice Department never went after those guys again.
You mentioned that there were 3 different drugs in Maryland's system. And if I remember this correctly, I think that Peter Lawford, Robert Kennedy, and somebody else, maybe it was a psychiatrist, were seen in a car a day or after or something. If they killed her, how did they do this? Did they just force the drugs into her? Did they get her drunk and put them in there? How did that happen?
Well, actually, I may have gone through it too quickly. The 3 barbiturates were found in Dorothy's death. In Dorothy's death.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
But that's okay. With Marilyn, they decided that she had ingested almost 50 pills within an hour, which is virtually impossible. There was no glass, there was no water available to her, anything else like that. With regard to Marilyn, people I think will be fascinated in Fighting for Justice in November. I've got 2 new accounts of exactly how Marilyn died. One from a nurse in Boston I get these people, and I hope that your listeners, if they have tips for me, they'll get in touch with me. You can go to my website, markshawbooks.com, and send me an email. I answer every single one of them. But a nurse in Boston gave me the idea, her theory, and because she was told about it by people close to Bobby Kennedy, how they were able to insert these barbiturates into Maryland's system. I don't want to get too much into that because it's in the new book,
I get it.
And you need to see it in the context of everything else.
Yes.
And then there's another situation where there's actually an eyewitness, a relative of Joe DiMaggio, who was on the phone to Marilyn when certain individuals invaded her house on the night she died, and gave an account of exactly what she heard. And just to tell you how scared she was, she would never tell any of her relatives what the familiar voice was that she heard. She was taking it to her grave. They asked her more than many, many times what was going on, but she would never tell them. So I've been able to provide an account of Marilyn. The autopsy was completely botched by Thomas Noguchi, whose name you are familiar with down there.
Yes.
In fact, just to give you an idea, he basically admitted a few weeks after the autopsy that, gee, I just forgot to look at some of her internal organs. And by the time I realized that, I went to try to find them, and they were missing. Believe it or not, that is exactly what happened with that autopsy.
That is shocking. In regards to JFK, because do I think that the Kennedys killed Marilyn Monroe? Yeah, I think that's I think that's highly likely. And when you mentioned this person, Dorothy Kilgallen, yeah, I think that's probably likely as well. And I can't remember who it is, but there was a person who put out a recent book that believes that one of his buddy's moms, who was also a paramour of Kennedy, was also killed, but I can't remember right off the top of my head. But let me ask you this. What about the JFK assassination? Is there new evidence? Because people, when we bring this up, they're going to want to know, is there any new news on the JFK assassination that you have uncovered in this research?
Yeah. Well, it's amazing because every time I think I'm done with this, something else comes up. And, I'm proud to say of the presentations and interviews I've done in different parts of the country, there's almost 7 million views of those on YouTube. And so I get all of these emails from people who've watched, and then they know something. And it's amazing, really, how many people are still alive who remember what happened in 1962 and 63 and 5. And so I'm going to bring this all around because I think you'll find it interesting that I got a call from a gentleman who was a legislative assistant to one of the Warren Commission members. And he started in on telling me that, first of all, he was at this Warren Commission member's home and sat right next to Dorothy Kilgallen at the dinner table.
Wow.
And so my eyes are flashing with all of that, and he knew Dorothy, and she was a bright light bulb. This is all in Fighting for Justice coming in November. And he also told me that he actually, hard to believe, but it wasn't, because he's a very distinguished scholar and author and statesman, that he accompanied the Warren Commission member to the Warren Commission hearings. And he gave me information such as the fact that there was internal corruption among the commission members. It's more than Oswald, but Earl Warren and the commission members keep pushing Oswald alone. I don't agree with the report. All of that, and it just was flabbergasting because nobody had ever gotten inside the Warren Commission. And so when we talk about new evidence about the JFK assassination, you always have to go back to this ludicrous theory that J. Edgar Hoover was shouting to the world, Oswald alone, Oswald alone. Well, this information I have in Fighting for Justice will destroy that for sure, because Hoover and LBJ absolutely packed the Warren Commission with Oswald alone people. I have audio tape conversations between the two of them where they talk about who they want and who they don't want, and they don't want anybody who's going to veer away from the Oswald alone theory. And so you have these Warren Commission members, and I've been able to find out that many of them never even heard the witnesses. The staff did, and then, they would report back to the member, and so on and so forth. And there's one disgruntled member who I won't disclose at this point because I'm still working on exactly how I'm going to put that in the new book. But there's a photograph of the Warren Commission giving the report to LBJ, and you can see that he's kind of hiding back behind everybody else because he was so upset about all of this. And then the most interesting thing, and I didn't realize this until the other day, one of the things that I was able to uncover is that Joe Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover were very, very close friends.
Wow.
And you will be able to read in Fighting for Justice how close, because at one point, get this, Joe Kennedy offered to give J. Edgar Hoover all of the necessary funds to run for president. And I have that in a document. They were so close at that time. So now Hoover is ramrodding the Warren Commission, and the Attorney General is Robert Kennedy. The Assistant Attorney General is Robert Katzenbach. And so Bobby stays out of it because he's still so upset that JFK died, and he's acknowledged that he feels like he was responsible for the death of his brother. He stays out of it, but they use Katzenbach to influence the commission to never look into the 1960 election that was fixed, and to never look into Bobby Kennedy's complicity in the death of Marilyn Monroe. So there was actually another opportunity where there could have been investigation, because there was none when Marilyn died with the Warren Commission, but the Kennedys basically used the pressure to keep the commission from going forward and looking into any of those that dirty laundry that the Kennedys had. So all of that then plays into some other new evidence that I have in Fighting for Justice. I mean, all you have to do in many of these cases, and I'm not the smartest guy who ever lived or the best researcher, but you just, we used to look at motive, means, opportunity from the crime, and who benefited.
Yes.
And in the death of JFK, just think about it. Let's go to the last one. Who benefited? Well, the first guy that benefited the most was who? Lyndon Johnson, because he became president.
Yeah.
But who else benefited? The mafia. Because, as I say, the Justice Department never went after those guys again. And so when you look at it that way, you can see why, if you really look at the JFK assassination as to why Bobby wasn't killed instead of why JFK was, it makes a lot of difference. And I will tell you that was confirmed by the Ruby trial prosecutor, Bill Alexander, who said, well, Bobby had a lot more enemies than JFK did.
Right.
I'm surprised they didn't kill Bobby.
Well, let me ask you this. Speaking of Bobby, so what do you think of the assassination of Bobby? I mean, do you think Sirhan was like a Manchurian candidate? Do you think he did it lucidly, or what do you think on that?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what I have in the new book, and because it says I'm going to do further research, but I have been able. Let's look at motive again. When Bobby, so Bobby Kennedy is leaving those mafiosos alone, and I have FBI records of Marcello and how his empire stretched to Dallas and everything else, and Jack Ruby. I've been able to connect Ruby and Oswald, and Ruby and Marcello, and Oswald and Marcello, and all of that. So all of that's firm. But what I've been able to look at now is the whole situation with regard to, who had the strongest motive to have killed Bobby Kennedy? So out there sits Carlos Marcello. He knows that Bobby Kennedy believed that he orchestrated the death of JFK, his brother. And now he's going to become president? What am I to think he's going to do? The first thing he's going to do, he's going to come after me. So there's your motive. So then what I've been trying to do is connect Marcello in with Sirhan. And for a long time, I thought I had a real thread there, but I'm still working on it. But at one particular point, I will tell you, Melvin Belli's client, Mickey Cohen, who was close to Marcello, at one point he oversaw all of the racetracks around Los Angeles, including Hollywood Park and the other major one,
Santa Anita.
Guess who worked at one of those racetracks? Sirhan. Now, that's as close as I've gotten so far. So if any of your listeners have more information about that, I'm still I still cannot say that I'm connecting Marcello with RFK's death. The motive is there, but I still don't believe that I've got enough primary source information to be able to concretely say that Marcello was involved in that death.
This is fascinating. And you know what? I don't think that people's interest in this will ever truly go away, because character flaws aside, JFK presented this image to America that they wanted to believe in, and then he was killed in this tragic way. And it's one of those things when people talk about certain things like the JFK assassination or UFOs or whatever, I don't know that we'll ever get the truth officially disclosed, but I think in the future, through the work of you and other people, eventually these things will just be self-evident. So even if we don't get disclosure from the government, it will just kind of be obvious. Look, this is what happened. It's not what they said, but I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's what I think will happen.
I've done this once before, and I didn't get anywhere, and that was to ask the Congress reinvestigate the JFK assassination. But I've got more ammunition now, and so I'm putting together all of the material in my books, and I'll put a letter together with it and all of that. I'm sending it to the whoever's going to be the head of the Judiciary Committee. And I've been asking my readers to send me, hopefully in the fall, their support for my doing that it needs to be reopened so we can try to find out, exactly what happened there. And I think, too, it's important, isn't it? I think you'll agree, the relevancy here.
Yes.
Anytime you have any belief, or you're told by either side of the media, perhaps more the mainstream media for sure, that there's some sort of allegation of government corruption. Boy, you need to ask all the right questions.
Absolutely.
Because 3 people died here, and the government was involved in each one of the cover-ups. And we want to know the truth. I mean, young people need to know the truth. I'm amazed at how many young people are interested in my research and interested in Dorothy and Marilyn and JFK, and I'm pleased to see that. But we need to be able to ask questions, and that's when in the fall I'm going to try to see if I can't get that JFK assassination reinvestigated. And then with Marilyn, I've been badgering your DA down there to reopen her case, but so far with no luck.
You've been badgering George Gascon?
You betcha.
Excellent. These questions are fascinating to the audience, and I get excited when I'm discussing them, and I'm glad you're out there pursuing it, and everything you said made sense to me, so I've really enjoyed this. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be on your program. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
I'd like to thank Mark Shaw for the time and the conversation. I will be asking him back in the near future to discuss his latest research and his thoughts on the current campaign of RFK Jr. If you'd like to know more about Mark's books, go to markshawbooks.com. You can also find him on Twitter @TheMarkShaw. Friends, if you enjoy my work, please subscribe to the podcast and leave a ranking or a review on your platform of choice. It helps the visibility of my show. I appreciate it from the bottom of my heart. Those stars, those thumbs up are free for you to give, so please share some love with the Michael Parker Media. I'll be back in the week with a new show, so until then, thank you for listening, and keep your heart and your mind open. Peace.